Hi, my name's Graham Davey and welcome to my introduction to watercolour painting. Now first of all I'm going to deal with the basics, so that's dealing with the paper, then onto brushes, paints, and also followed by accessories, and then I shall do a number of demonstration techniques which will be useful in your painting. One of the mistakes of people who are setting out to use watercolour is that they use any kind of paper, and of course most papers just can't deal with water. So it's best to use paper that's designed specifically for watercolour painting, and there are two types of paper. One is made from wood pulp, which is in fact most paper is, and the other is from cloth, or sometimes known as rag. And the professional artist tends to use the cloth type paper because there are certain qualities of it when it comes to glazing, which I won't go into. And so for starting out, you're probably best using the wood pulp type paper, and probably the best type of paper on the market is made by Bockingford, and you can get them in various pads, and I would recommend using 300 grams. Now that's one of the characteristics of watercolour paper, is in the fact that it's got heavy weight. It goes anything up from 200 grams up to 800 grams, and the heavier you go, the better it is for dealing with water, and reduces the impact of warping. And in fact a lot of professional people like to work at the top end. The next factor is that they are rolled, and they're put between rollers and pressed, and what that does is it compacts the fibres of the paper and makes it more dense. But the thing about that is that you get a texture, and there are three types of texture. One is rough, which is a kind of mottling effect. The one is smooth, known as hot pressed, and then there's an intermediate one between the two, which is sort of subtle pressing and slightly smooth, and that's called cold pressed or not. God knows why it's called not. It's probably because it's not rough and it's not smooth, but there you are. But of course that determines your choice when it comes to choosing paper, and the best way for that is for me to demonstrate the qualities if you paint on these particular kind of textures. I'm going to start by adding some cobalt blue, and you probably could already see that the paper has started to give a kind of mottling effect. I'm just trying to add a bit more blue to it, and just flicking the brush across the top so you can see how the paper sort of fragments the strokes. Now onto the cold pressed. You can see that there's not so much of the mottling with this. Now onto the hot pressed. Now this is the nice smooth paper. There's hardly any mottling at all, and the paint is far more even though there's a few little blotches. So there you are, there's the three types. So there's only just one thing left to do while we're on the subject of paper. It is to deal with the fact that when you're using it, the paper tends to warp, and I will just show you one thing that's useful to avoid warping. Now before you start painting, it's best to what is termed as stretching the paper, which really means just sticking it down on a board. I should do that. So you do it all round with masking tape. And what that does, it firmly holds the paper down. And now I'm going to give it a wash. Try not to get it too wet when you're doing a wash. You really just need to dampen the paper rather than wet the paper. So you don't want it swimming, as they say, on the paper. So there, I've completely wet it. And I can see there is a slight rise because the paper will absorb the water. Now if I can show you, there you go. You can see that it hasn't risen at all. It's perfectly flat. So you can now start painting. And this is my set of brushes. As you can see, it's quite a modest number of brushes. This is my wash brush. It's made from squirrel hair, and I use that to apply water onto paper for when I want to do wet on wet. You can use it for painting, but I use it purely as a wash brush. These four here, which are brown coloured, are Kolinsky sable brushes. The Kolinsky sable is top of the range sable, I suppose what you might call the Rolls Royces of brushes. Got them as a Christmas present, so I didn't have to pay out a lot of fortune for them. I like them because they keep their shape and the tips are keep to a nice point, so that enables me to do detail work. I tend to use this one, which is a size 10. I tend to use that most of the time, and because it's very versatile. And I simply use these when I'm going down into smaller areas of painting. And this is a size 6, and that's a 4, and that's a 2. Now this one is a plain sable. I use this one for obviously just doing small detail work. So hence I use riggers, and these are of red sable. I've got a 1 and a 2. And they are much better at producing a line because they can hold a lot more paint, and that's perfect for that. And the other one, which is an odd one, which is a fantail, and that I don't know what it's made of. And I use that for painting grasses because it's just great for that, and also for doing hair. I'm going to demonstrate some of the uses of the brushes. And because it's small, you could probably do a very small area before it starts to run out. If you want to do, say, a line with it, it's can go so far, then you see how it peters out, and that's because it simply can't hold that much water. So to get a decent line, I'm going to use a rigger. And that's peters out quite soon. So I'm going to go to the next size up, which is the size 2 rigger. Gives a slightly thicker line, but you know, it really holds a lot of water. It can go off the page. So you can see the benefit of a rigger. Now the size 10, which I've got, can hold a lot of water. And as a consequence, you too can do a line with this. you could probably go on to do a lot more. Whoops. You can see that because of it's holding a lot of water and paint, you can do, it just keeps on going. So even though it's a brush you would normally using for doing large areas, it can also do fine work as well, which is why I use that one quite a lot, because it's very versatile. Now the last brush I want to deal with is what I call the fantail. I don't know whether it's really called a fantail, but that's what I call it anyway. And the advantage of that is it's really good for getting sort of grass effects, and also for hair. So that's excellent for that, and you can sort of overlay it with different colours for the hairs and for the grasses. So that's a brush that's worth considering. So that's covered all the brushes really. Now for the important bit, the paint. Now the paint is different from other paints in that it's made from gum arabic with the pigment, and there's a number of paint manufacturers out there, but most of them are aimed at the professional. Now there's one particular brand that I would go for where you have a budget range, and only a few manufacturers actually make a budget range aimed at art students, and I would say the best of them is probably Winsor & Newton. And Winsor & Newton both do a professional range and the budget range, which they call Cotman, named after John Cotman, the famous Victorian watercolour painter. They do about 40 colours, similar colours to the professional series. Now take Cobalt Blue for example. In the professional series, the Cobalt Blue will be 4 times the cost of a Cobalt Blue in the Cotman series, and that's because it's made from cobalt. Whereas the Cobalt Blue, which would be called Cobalt Blue Hue because it's not Cobalt Blue, is exactly the same colour, but it's made from a synthetic ingredient. And if you were to paint with the Cobalt Blue in the professional series alongside the Cobalt Blue Hue in the Cotman range, you would be very hard pushed to tell the difference. And they both have that vibrancy you would get from a professional colour. And that's basically the real reason why I go for Cotman, because I actually think for the budget range, the quality of the colours are extremely high. They've just compromised by making them cheaper by using synthetic substitutes for the real colours. Now I'm just going to move the camera down for a minute. The Winsor & Newton Cotman paints come in 2 forms, the tubes and the half pans. The tube, smaller size is 8ml and costs you about £2.50. The larger size, 21ml, and costs you about £5. And then you've got £2 for the half pans. But of course, if you're considering buying a lot of pans, it's probably good to get this kind of kit where you get a case with the colours, and this is about £16 for about 16 colours, so you can see it's £1 a colour. So it's worth buying the little kit, but of course you have to realise that some of the colours you get aren't particularly the ones you want, so you have to consider that. I find the little kit of half pans very handy when I'm painting outdoors. It really is convenient, but when I'm working in the studios I actually find the tubes are much better, because it seems to be much freer to be able to mix them. So it's all a matter of personal preference really. This is the 40 colours of the Cotman range, and they're there to offer you a choice, and it's probably a bewildering choice. And so I'm going to deal with how to choose the colours in a moment. These 12 colours are my recommendations for starting out. Now you'll notice that there are no secondary colours, no orange, purple or green, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now the three most important colours to start off with is certainly your primary colours, which is cadmium red, cadmium yellow and cobalt blue. They are the three colours which are the primary colours. Now if you were to mix those you would get a lot of other colours, but they will be very strong saturated colours. So what I recommend is that you get colours which are on the other side of the colour wheel to the primary colour. So for example, I've got cadmium red pale, which is a slightly orangey red, and then on the other side we've got alizarin crimson, which is a slightly purple red. And then on with the yellow you've got lemon yellow, which is a slight tilt to the greens, and then you've got raw sienna, which is a slight tint to the orange, but it's also a slightly brown. And then you've got Prussian blue, which is a slightly greeny blue, and then you've got ultramarine, which is a slight purpley blue. Now what those colours give you is a much wider range of secondary colours, and that is the reason why I give you as secondary primary colours. It's also helpful to have a group of permanent rose, burnt sienna and burnt umber. They are very good additional colours for skin tones. Also it's very good to have the browns, because browns is difficult to mix. Burnt sienna is very good as even as a second red or a third red, depending on how you look at it. And also it's very good for warming other colours. And then you've got burnt umber, which is also good for darkening, just a little touch of burnt umber with any other colours. But burnt umber mixed with ultramarine will also give you a black, and in turn, if by diluting it down with water you can get various greys, so you can get a cold grey or a warm grey. You can also get greys from mixing Prussian blue with alizarin, and also burnt sienna with ultramarine. And of course with the secondary colours you can get cadmium red and cadmium red pale mixed with cadmium yellow gives you a very good orange. Alizarin crimson with ultramarine gives you a very good purple, but of course with 3 lots of yellow and 3 lots of blue you can get actually 9 combinations of green, so that's excellent for doing landscape work. So that's my recommendations of colours. Oh, one other thing, white. Now white is rarely used in watercolours. If you want to go paler with your colours you actually use water. And also because if you're not adding white you actually keep to your pigment, which is excellent. And if you do want to introduce white you simply use the colour of the paper. You'll need 2 jars for water, something to keep your brushes in, a palette to mix your paints, a kitchen towel for blotting, a scrap of paper for testing your paint, a hairdryer, watercoloured soluble pencils for drawing, and water-soluble crayons, and lastly masking fluids and agents.